security, human displacement, human trafficking, and disaster management, recognize the intricate interplay between these sectors. So a judge in Pakistan who is looking at climate justice is looking at a whole different world than a judge sitting in the north looking at climate justice, because he's just looking at mitigation, which is a very linear way of looking at climate justice. But I think the scope of adjudication in Pakistan changes when you look at climate justice in the global south. So for the global south, climate justice introduced a significant shift in jurisprudence. It demanded a more sophisticated and inclusive approach to adjudication, one that accounts for multidimensional impacts of climate change across multiple sectors. This necessitates remedies that go beyond retributive measures against polluters and instead adopts restorative and rehabilitative approaches. Courts are now required to design adaptive remedies to protect the rights and dignities of communities disproportionately affected by climate change. So we have to come up with how to come up with a more resilient urban planning, how to come up with a more resilient agricultural planning, climate resilient irrigation plans. This is something that we need to look at. We have a case that comes before us, does not talk about climate change. It might talk about irrigation and water scarcity, but actually you're looking at a climate change issue. There was a case that came to us that said that we want to expand the cement plant in Kalar Kahar, the DG cement case. There was nobody argued climate change in that case. They said we just want to add on, expand the cement plant in Kalar Kahar, and we said no, Kalar Kahar is a water scarce area, and we did not allow that expansion. But hidden in that entire case was the whole concept of climate change, because it's a water scarce country. So this evolution of adaptive climate justice or adaptive jurisprudence, which just belongs to Pakistan or the global south, unlike the north, marks a pivotal moment in the legal landscape where the scope of justice is expanded to address interconnected challenges that were previously outside the purview of environmental law. We now suggest climate resilient urban planning, agriculture, irrigation, farming practices, etc. So the scope increases. If we examine the climate jurisprudence, we see that it has been largely directional. So what have we done in the last maybe 5-7 years? Coming up with very interesting jurisprudence which has been globally quoted now, especially Asghar Laghari case and some of the others. People talk about it internationally. But what has happened in Pakistan? Has anything changed as far as climate justice is concerned? No, I would imagine. Because all we did was we gave directions. Please do fix this. Please go do fix this. Come up with a new plan to do this. But never figured out whether at all the government had political will, but that's aside. Did they ever have the money to do this? Or did they have the budget to do this? We never talked about it. Somehow the government never raised this question before us either. So while the courts kept on directing in Asghar Laghari, DG Cement, and a number of other score of cases that we'll do this, CDA was directed to come up with a design which is climate resilient. All buildings in Islamabad should be urban climate resilient. But nothing really happened. The directions are there. They've been quoted all over the world. The jurisprudence is very robust and exciting, but nothing happens on the ground. So debate and discussion at the recent COP29 at Baku brought a fresh perspective of what is really not happening. To address these challenges, to achieve meaningful adaptation or to succeed in a claim for loss and damage caused due to climate change, climate finance becomes an indispensable lifeline. So climate change may be global, but the solutions are not shared equally. Those with resources hoard them, leaving the most vulnerable to perish, said Greta Thunberg. So for a country like Pakistan, which is highly vulnerable to climate change, the availability of robust financial resources is critical for building resilience and protecting its people. Climate finance supports adaptive measures like food defenses, flood defenses, drought-resistant crops, sustainable urban infrastructure, and community-based disaster response systems. Climate finance ensures that individuals can live lives marked by dignity and security, with access to basic needs such as clean water, safe shelter, reliable food supplies. So in essence, climate finance is not just an economic necessity, it is a moral imperative. It ensures that the most vulnerable, who have contributed the least to global emissions, have the resources to adapt, survive and thrive in the changing world. For Pakistan, climate finance is not merely a tool for policy. It is the foundation of hope for the future, where every citizen can live with dignity, security, and promise of a better tomorrow. So climate finance is not about helping, it is about restoring justice in a system that is fundamentally skewed against the global south. Climate finance refers to what? Where do we get this climate finance? So climate finance refers to local, national or transnational financing drawn from public, private and alternative sources of financing that seeks to support adaptation actions that will address climate change. Its origins trace back to the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, which establishes the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. This principle acknowledges that while all nations share a common responsibility to combat climate change, developed nations bear a greater burden due to their historic contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. So ensuring climate finance, and this is the judicial approach, or at least what we're thinking now, and I don't know how the executive looks at it, but this is how the judiciary is probably going to look at it. Ensuring climate finance is therefore the most pivotal part of climate justice. I think the next decade, the jurisprudence that's going to come out of Pakistan should be talking about how do we go about getting in climate finance and how best could we arrange that. So climate finance is actually our lifeline, if you look at it, that can help us strengthen our infrastructure, agriculture, water management, economic inequality and disaster resilience. The climate finance is going to do all this. And it must be mobilized on an unprecedented scale and be accessible in a timely manner to those who need it the most. So without climate finance, our right to life, which is Article 9 of the Constitution, our right to human dignity, which is Article 14, is under threat to our understanding. Therefore, climate finance in countries from the global south like Pakistan is fundamentally a human right. And that's what I want to underline. I think climate finance is the new human right, and that has to be examined and looked at in that context of climate justice, as it is essential to preserving human life and human dignity. Human dignity has a major role to play when you talk about displacement, when you're talking about your entire crops being totally destroyed, you don't know where to take your agriculture, where to go and where to build a new livelihood. So if climate finance continues to fall short, the gap between developed and developing nations may grow, leading to what now some people term as climate apartheid, where wealthy nations protect themselves from climate impacts while poorer nations are left to bear the brunt. So where is this climate finance? And this is what I want to address and highlight. Climate finance would largely come from the global funds under the Paris Agreement. So we have the Green Climate Fund, GCF, very good, established under the UNFCCC to channel about $100 billion annually by 2020 to developing countries, as it said. Performance, they've just pledged $40 billion and far below its target. The issues, the disbursement rate is low. Only 25% of the pledged funds have been disbursed. And I looked around and I looked at the architecture behind these funds. How do we access these funds? How do we reach out to these funds? What's the process? It's unbelievably difficult. You can't reach out to these funds. How do you go about it? How do you handle dispute settlements? How do you negotiate on this? Suppose you say our loss and damage or my adaptation budget is 20 billion and they say no, we just think it's 10 billion. How do we settle that issue? Where does the issue of climate science come in? Is the country prepared with climate science to argue and articulate a claim before these international forums? So to me, it's like truck ki batti ke piche hum lage hue, there is nothing that's coming our way. So I just want to highlight that this global finance that we're talking about is not actually trickling down. I mean, as a judge, I looked at, there are no procedures, there's no architecture, there's no regulatory framework, and how does it actually go? It falls outside our jurisdiction, we can't really enforce it, for which I propose that there has to be an international climate court because there's no way you police all these things, but there is no mechanism available, and that sort of worries me because this is going on for such a long time and nothing is trickling down. Similarly, adaptation fund, so there is nothing really that's coming down. The loss and damage mechanisms are also there, but emerging under decisions made under COP27 to address irreparable climate losses in vulnerable nations. Now, let me highlight that loss and damage is an immediate requirement. You need that money immediately We need $20 billion to fix the flood issue, you see, so that's the money that you require immediately, whereas adaptation could be slightly more continuous, slightly long-term, but loss and damage is an immediate requirement, but nothing is actually coming our way. So as far as loss and damage is concerned, implementation is still in its infancy with no clear funding architecture or substantial disbursements. Highly politicized with donor countries resisting mandatory contributions. So challenges in accessing global climate funds, there are bureaucratic hurdles, then we have stringent eligibility criteria which we cannot meet, inequitable distribution, larger developing countries with better institutional capacities like India and Brazil often secure more funds, leaving smaller or more vulnerable nations behind. Small island developing states as IDS and LDCs receive minimal funds despite being the most vulnerable. So power imbalance also, decision making in global funds is often dominated by donor countries with limited input from the recipient nations. So this goes on, and there is a slow disbursement rate as we look at it. But that worries me, see. There is also a political resistance to this. What has been the response of the government? Well, I think they did put up a good show at Baku, and I think the current advisor to the Ministry of Climate Change, Mrs. Rumina Khalid, is trying to do as much as she can, and I compliment her efforts. But, you know, there is nothing much that comes out, and I look at their official statement, and they say we've just finalized the National Climate Finance Strategy. Very good. Where is it? What is it? I haven't seen it. It's just been finalized somewhere. So, and they say that we've applied, we've made applications to the Green Fund. Nobody gives a figure as to what money has actually come to Pakistan against it. And they keep referring to figures, and I don't want to bother you with those. It talks about a number of figures, but nothing really clearly shows what's the amount that has actually come to Pakistan. So this goes on. So what do we do then? We could have some other options also. Okay. Actually, I'm not used to this in the courts, but not for my structures. Nobody tells me how much to see, but I'll just shut up in just a while. No, so I'll just cut through this, but some of the initiatives that the government wants to take is to reach out to the vulnerable 20. V20 as is, and we're trying to come up with a coalition of judges in the V20 countries and see if we can come up with a strategy on climate justice and see what climate diplomacy can go into it and see. But let me just quickly now, considering that I just have 5 minutes, I thought we could rely on alternative sources of Islamic finance. That's another big area, and there are a number of areas that you can go into that and see if we can raise money through Islamic finance, carbon markets. All of this is still in discussions. Nothing has really come through. Maybe some other Islamic countries have done this, but we haven't reached out and done that yet. So I just want to then quickly, as a conclusion, see as to what the approach of the judiciary is going to be as to what we can do about all this, because otherwise, the climate finance, as far as the executive and the government is concerned, I see that still there is no money. As I said, there could be domestic, you can raise money domestically through private players like the carbon markets. We could have the Islamic finance going. Let me also tell you that the Climate Finance Act 2017 talks about climate fund. And recently at the Supreme Court, we took up this case, earlier took up this case under the Constitutional Bench, to which I am not yet a party. So now the new Constitutional Bench will look into it, but we're talking about there is no authority. The law came out in 2017. We're sitting in 2024. There is no authority, climate change authority, which is an apex body looking at climate change in Pakistan. So there is no authority. So the court reached out to the government and directed them to come up with an authority. They're still working on it and interviewing people how to get the authority in place, and maybe they will soon do it. The second question that we asked them in the court was that under the law there is a climate change fund. Is there any money in the fund? Is the fund created? There is no fund established. Considering that climate change is the most serious existential threat Pakistan is facing, there is no climate change fund under the Climate Change Act 2017 as we speak, and nothing was allocated in the recent budget either, which is sad. So, secondly, there are no rules. Even if there was a climate change fund in Pakistan, how does an individual access it? If my lands have been destroyed because of climate change due to drought, how do I access the climate fund? What's the mechanism? What are the rules? What is the, how does this get, how do we work through this? We don't know. So the pattern globally, the pattern domestically is also the same as it is internationally. So what do we do? So how do the courts look at it? And that's, I think, we can kind of play a transformative role in this area, and that could be by considering, and I think the first and foremost is the recognizing climate finance as a fundamental right. So that's one, that's the beginning as far as we are concerned. I don't know what executive is doing and I don't know what the politicians are up to, but at the courts we think recognizing climate finance as a fundamental right is important, because right to life, right to dignity, even right to fair trial could come into it, and right to non-discrimination. Courts can recognize climate finance as a fundamental human right, emphasizing its necessity for the survival and development of vulnerable communities by establishing a clear judicial understanding that climate finance is tied to the right to life, health and sustainable environment. Courts can push for stronger legal obligations for both domestic governments and international entities. We could also, as we're looking at it, we think that obligations of the global north be viewed as climate debt and push the governments to press their claims more forcefully. Climate justice focuses on climate finance and more so on reparative justice. So to my mind, climate justice now moves on to climate finance, but climate finance also further moves on to reparative justice, which focuses on compensating communities or individuals for harm caused by environmental degradation. So if the compensation isn't coming, then the entire literature, the entire debate is meaningless to my mind. So it has to be now, the future of climate justice is reparative justice. There has to be compensations coming our way so that we actually tangibly change things. The judiciary plans to have a serious judicial oversight over climate financing, pushing the government to making their claims internationally or even locally, but nothing so far has happened in that direction, but that can be done. So in addition to this, just last point, that in addition to climate change and our view of climate justice, we also want to view climate change as a part of the triple planetary crisis that UN has identified, which is climate change, loss of biodiversity, and pollution, which we just talked about. So I think we require nature finance, another initiative in the country, to look at pollution and to look at biodiversity loss, because they're all interconnected. Loss of biodiversity, pollution has a direct bearing on climate change, and climate change in reverse has a bearing on this. So this is how we can go about looking at the future by underlining that climate finance is something critical and most important, and we can't sort of possibly move without attending to the issue of climate finance. And I'll just end it with a quote from President of Kiribati, who said that the global south is tired of empty words on climate finance. We need accountability, fairness, and funds that address our